I recently haven't been uploading a lot of the recordings that I've made because they've devolved quite badly into ranting. Although I feel that there is perhaps some shred of value in them that might be worth uploading, but obviously that's embarrassing. It probably also comes from the fact that I don't plan out uh, sort of a draft or an outline or a sort of a thread, and so uh, I don't properly prepare enough that I can avoid having to complete certain tangents, and then those tangents lead on to other tangents. Otherwise, I feel embarrassed that there's a kind of there's a skeptical target which can be used to attach projection, because I feel like I'm often speaking to an audience, or perhaps going to be witnessed or heard by an audience uh, that is prone to quite a lot of projection from their ideological narrative that they are entrenched within or embedded within. And in some sense, we're all prone to narratives. I'd like to think that I'm very conscious of the narratives that I contend within consciously. Anyway, it's um, I've said recently to someone, which I think is a good encapsulation of this sort of issue, is that the ability to co-create narratives is a very important ability to cultivate, but it's somewhat dangerous if you don't principally and fundamentally believe in the non-concreteness of such structures. That doesn't mean that they can't hold a lot of subjective value for an individual, and that subjective value doesn't lead to significance and important properties in the world, even. But it's essentially, I believe, it's dangerous to toy with narratives if you don't also cultivate the ability to deconstruct and unplug oneself from narratives, and also to be capable of holding oneself captive to a framework which is contended by the self. Um, I think that if you're not able to sort of do all three of those things, like enjoy narratives, but also be able to destroy them, and also be able to uh, create them with a certain amount of seriousness and carefulness and selectivity, um, and that sort of without each of those three uh, faculties, uh, you're going to, well, there are a lot of things that could permute. There are a lot of sort of possible permutations of different forms of imbalance. I mean, some of them sort of usually run aground themselves or develop some insight into their own sort of tactical uh, uh, imbalance or malfeasance that they see in their own record of behavior, that there's some kind of unsustainable self uh, generative sort of failure. Um, but some forms of uh, narrative management, I would say, or style of embodied unconscious, are particularly pernicious because uh, their hypocrisy is so latent that it doesn't show up. Uh, it's all what I would describe as packaged under a kind of unified narrative framework, which sort of claims also to be beyond all narrative. So it's sort of it's disguised its own sort of I think in this sense, uh, everyone has a meta framework. Some people sort of toil beneath it unconsciously to some extent, being particularly enamored with particular prized pieces of that narrative puzzle, which to them just seem to be anchor points, um, which are indispensable. Uh, Now, what I was getting into even before I went into this particular exposition is that when you can freely transcend all these sorts of things, uh, you have to go back down to the serious business. Um, of actually working out how to do some horse trading within this potential sea of fluidity and such. And I and then what I get to is essentially the synthesis that you actually need to have a justifiable ethical edifice, justifiable ethical framework. And a lot of people, I take it, would slander my position as being sort of part of this pre-trance fallacy, sort of Keegan stage narrative. Now, I mean, I've had it represented to me many times. This holy writ of the Keegan stages, and let me give some critical response, and this is perhaps slightly unfair because I haven't read David Chapman's book, and I'm going to anticipate that there are a lot of very useful things probably in Keegan's work, but uh, I guess I might as well be blunt about what the problems of it I project will be, or what they probably are. Um, is that Keegan is surveying uh, what is the source material of Keegan's work? He's aggregating psychological data. He's aggregating psychological, clinical um, experts that are collating and collecting uh, knowledge garnered from psychotherapies. Okay, now what is the value of this base material? And let me just admit and say that Keegan taking all of this information and aggregating it and finding structures and commonalities and creating a model is a very valuable thing. It certainly is, and I believe that there are certainly real structures that are approximated by all of Keegan's observations and in whatever aggregations that he's made. Because I mean, I can see um, huge correspondences in the Keegan stages of development and what I have found in my own private research and psychological modeling, which quite frankly it cannot be compared to Keegan's work because, as again, like what is the value of someone who has merely aggregated information from broad disparate sources, or I mean, not perhaps that disparate, but they might as well be disparate because, let's say, the pretension and the structure to the field of psychology is nebulous, is up in the air. So you can certainly, from all the different schools of psycho tech, you can maybe find commonalities of people groping from different schools of thinking coming up against the same sort of uh, recurring theme or generative mechanism or something like that. So you can definitely outline structure. Can you identify that structure? Can you name it? Well, I mean, that's obviously up for scholarly contention and further refinement and debate. Um, so, I mean, the containers in Keegan, I think, are certainly viable and to, in fact, all find their place in being reprocessed and being reevaluated and being reinterpreted. Um, and that certainly Keegan's work is a useful stepping stone for somebody else as well to theorize. Now, I would say the general problem with Keegan's work is that, well, he's probably got a sort of a kind of tunnel vision, and I'll describe this tunnel vision, which is that, well, first of all, he can't too uh, starkly undermine his own field. He can't too starkly um, invalidate the structures on which he stands upon the shoulders thereof. Yeah, and we have to remember that also psychology is very much interwoven with psychiatry as well. But you know, essentially, these are people who are paid to sympathize with people and seem to do something for their clients and their customers. And in some sense, whatever cannot be cured by perhaps reframing, if I to be slightly slanderous about that's the capability of a psychologist, is the ability to reframe. But I mean, there are pedagogical uh, technologies and instruments which are certainly capable of doing some things for some people. But essentially, they always have a legal narcotic in their back pocket, which they can peddle in order to continue to monitor and to perform the kind of human triage, which in some sense I would say that the field itself is tethered to a weak bank of heuristics and peddling false authority in order to safeguard its own reproduction of its system of knowledge and such, which is all baked into what I can only describe as a decadent culture and society, which fails to have integrity. I mean, I would say generally what psychology does as a sociological phenomena, and psychiatry especially as well, is that it pretends to offer access for people to enjoy a high trust society, and it does so at the expense of integrity. It undermines and undercuts integrity. And this is a theme which is shared in many pseudo intellectual pursuits, or let's say pursuits which don't care about ethics or integrity as much as they can be said to perform some pro social label and narrative within some edifice that can be concocted in order to keep everything on the up and up, so that everyone can go along to get along. Because, in some sense, you know, I'm going down this whole sort of rabbit hole, although it is thematically, I think, comparable to the topic that I wanted to get into, which is something that I have spoken out against before. It is a term which I particularly despise and I will try to ridicule it, I guess, is collective intelligence. Now, there is certainly something that can be described as collective intelligence, and I would think that that is something to do with, let's say, the higher rate of functioning which is enjoyed in a high trust society. Uh, but to expand now into what is now being called as self-organizing collective intelligence, I think now, I mean, that's just fascism. I mean, that's literally the spirit of political fascism. The idea that, well, people at heart are just natural totalitarians and we can share a decentralized sort of Führer principle, and I've gotten to the end of the argument without making the syllogism, but essentially, what I'm trying to describe uh, is that a self-organizing collective intelligence is basically another word for mob rule, in which only a lowest common denominator can be served, and a lowest common identity is iconistically uh, enforced by what will only be, very disgusting forms of field marshalling and pseudo intellectual hackery of any sort of kind. I must say that the admiration that I have for Christianity in some sense, or obviously this is not true in Christianity at large, but in the Christianity that I doctrinally subscribe to and understand, is that it actually has a highest common denominator. Common denominator in its orientation, in essentially willing the integrity in order to achieve a high trust society, not wishing for the end of having a high trust society, but willing to engage and develop the integrity. But as soon as you have a self organizing collective intelligence, where is integrity located? In some external locus of, well, it's organizing all by itself. Well, what is this the spirit of? What is this the zeitgeist of? Excuse me. This is the zeitgeist of Weimar Germany 1920s. This is the zeitgeist of Nuremberg rallies, dissatisfaction marches. Yes, let's be so self-organized in our dissatisfaction. This is mob rule. This is the rule of man. Uh, and it will not have the integrity to bring law onto itself. Because law is perpetrated by the the group of goats in this herd that will perform the inquisitional function of keeping the purity space of the self-organization uh, sacrosanct, and in some sense the sanctimoniousness of the self-organized milieu. Uh, this is French culture, quite frankly. I mean, this is the culture of assimilation, assimilation or fuck off. Get get with the program. You're disrupting the self-organization of the collective intelligence. Anyway, basically, the problem is that certain words don't function with self-organized collective intelligence. Those certain words are words like conviction and integrity in some sense. I guess you could have, or you have to have a weird kind of compartmentalization where conviction and integrity are just disparate creatures that must be uh, uh, separated in order to even dream of such a stupid notion as self-organized collective intelligence. Now, I understand that people want to maybe enjoy and entreat themselves with conceptual deep dives into synchronicity and things like that. And that might be harmless, but in some sense, it's a fundamental commitment to a kind of uncarefulness or unseriousness or untruthfulness. It's this idea of, well, let's just facilitate the collective intelligence at the expense of any kind of integrity and understanding from the self. In some sense, it is. I mean, I would conceptually link it under the umbrella of the love of not understanding, the love of darkness, but specifically the love of ignorance, in some sense, or the love of banishing some kind of access to knowledge, which must contain uh, uh, some ethereal external uh, anyway, that's not such a useful poetical tangent to go down. But the point that I'm trying to draw out is that okay, I guess I could go further into describing it, but I'll just speak about the diagnosis of where this comes from internally. So, the source of these types of manifestations are uh, quite weirdly, I would say, Keegan stage 2 and Keegan stage 4. It's a weird kind of colonization from Keegan stage 3 of Keegan stage 2 and Keegan stage 4. And in some sense, I would say it has a kind of a weird kind of alchemical synthesis, because in some sense that connection between Keegan stage 2 and Keegan stage 3, I think, is archetypally usually coded as being masculine, and the linkage between Keegan stage 3 and Keegan stage 4, I would archetypally link as being feminine. Um, and when this is uh, concocted into the chimera of some kind of zeitgeist or cultural envelope or something like that, um, anyway, it's quite a zoo of sexual energy in some sense that gets sublimated into weird kind of political sort of uh, imaginations, and in some sense, everyone's individual imagination is set loose in a weird kind of solipsistic or autistic atomism that gets to pretend to be whatever it wants to be within this, sort of monster. I'll describe it as that, this beastly form of self organizing collective intelligence, where the understanding does not flow from individual to individual. Um, it flows through the medium of this atomized sort of void, this void that contains these atomized entities that are all tethered equally to the same kind of agnosticism or epistemic pluralism or something like that. So the cost is essentially the void of your own soul, but in some sense it's not a voided soul, it's a commixture between essentially what I would describe as nihilism and narcissism. So there's a kind of narcissistic spirit in a nihilistic soul. And that's the kind of alchemical chimera that is being concocted, which I would also say is perhaps, I'm taking this from secondary sources, but every time that I'm told why my ideas don't conform with Keegan's model of development, uh, I do think that maybe I would have to look at the source more carefully, but I do imagine that everyone that I have spoken to has perhaps not misunderstood it, and that there is a corruption in Keegan's work. And I would say generally what he has probably done is he has modeled his apex of developmental integration as a kind of STEM person who really believes that the scientific method is something of the model of Keegan stage 4 and is actually a way in which that you can access Keegan stage 5. And so you've got this kind of in some sense I would say the belief that science itself is a true narrative, or is concrete, or is the concreteness in which everything else sort of inhabits, is I don't know how, I've talked about sort of, you can want that. It's not, I don't think it's bad to want a kind of canonical narrative, but the idea that it's not going to be built out of your epistemic agency, that it's not going to be built out of an epistemic responsibilism, the idea that you're going to counterfeit some charter and some constitution, that it's an indispensable epistemic reliabilism that we all need to. This is just basically nihilism. This is abject nihilism. Um, in some sense, it's latent nihilism, because you'll only really manifest the nihilism when you get into Keegan stage 4. If you get into Keegan stage 4 and you didn't do so um, by using the Keegan stage 3 um, circus, as it is, in some sense, the insoluble circus of sort of unconscious energies and such, if you don't use that to steel man your own, what you want to be right, and then realize its own breakpoint, realize its own sort of failure, and then realize essentially how to compromise that into some stable principle that is capable of conserving itself by radically sacrificing and adapting itself. If you don't go through that kind of humility, and realize that that's in some sense uh, humility and faith is the precursor, and I would say generally the door to Keegan stage 4, um, or at least to stably contending within Keegan stage 4, which I do claim is basically static. Keegan stage 4 is like becomes a solid state computational sort of processor um, that is always being, in some sense, it is like the brainiac that you go to ask a question and it just spits out an answer, but you don't ask it metaphysical questions, uh, and to get metaphysical answers, uh, you ask at Keegan stage 3 questions, and you get Keegan stage 3 outputs, essentially. Like the, I believe Keegan stage 4, or the ego, is there to be the balloon uh, that is being held by a Keegan stage 3 um, uh, I was just going to say like footing or legs or something, or feet, but so the point at which you make contact with the ground is Keegan stage 3, and in some sense the ground is made out of the surface of Keegan stage 2, and you don't dig in the ground, you walk on the ground. And so your Keegan stage 3 is learning to trample the Keegan stage 2, while you are holding this balloon, which is in some sense, I mean, okay, I don't know if that's a useful picture or not, but and the balloon is like a hope and a prayer and a dream, perhaps any of these things. But it's a balloon. You're walking around with a balloon in your hand like a 5-year-old child. Um, a balloon on a string. Sorry if that wasn't in the picture for you. That's what I was thinking of. Someone holding a balloon attached to a string with helium in it, so it's floating. Um, and everyone's got their balloon, but you have to be very careful, I guess, because everyone has their own balloon, and in some sense, uh, I don't know how much I want to get into this metaphor because it's perhaps too tricky to say that. I do think that you can give your balloon to somebody else to duplicate, uh, and perhaps your balloon can have, in some sense, duplicated other balloons inside of it. And that is how we share values and know each other, perhaps. But that's only possible if Keegan stage 4 is a static. And in some sense, obviously, when that static is dislocated from Keegan stage 3, it has no, uh, it's not alive in some sense, because in some sense, if you steal someone's balloon and duplicate it, uh, that duplication is still not the original, that's still going around with that person. You just have a duplication of it. So you can perhaps emulate how their stage form might function, but you won't be able to. It's not the same thing as actual communication. It's just a kind of way of modeling in some sense. But I would say it's a necessary modeling in order to actually facilitate actual collective intelligence in some realizable form. Um, but that obviously is can't really be called collective intelligence so much as that it should be technically called intrasubjective, uh, interpersonal or interpersonal subjective, uh, bridging. But yeah, I mean, this idea that you can talk about bridging and never be able to bridge two individual minds, uh, because of the needs of the self-organizing collective intelligence. I mean, it's ironically frustrating. I mean, it's ironically sort of self-refuting, and in some sense, I think it'll only ever be able to sustain itself by that sort of sanctimonious purity policing, and sort of either sort of baiting people with sort of purity tests, and spiraling into an indulgence of sort of sympathy extraction and sympathy mongering, and special kind. I mean, in some sense, it very quickly devolves into exactly what you saw in the Ku Klux Klan, with the grand dragged wizard vizier people. I mean, in some sense, all the social justice progressive people are quite functionally exactly the same as the Ku Klux Klan. They just have a different window dressing. They have a different style. They have a different. Uh, they have a different. I frankly, I don't even see it as being that different. Um, and in some sense, many of them would probably uh, jump at the chance to wear an armband or some sort of token, or some kind of um, trinket of belonging to the self-organizing collective intelligence. There is a small difference between, um, let's say, overt National Socialists, uh, because they find the need to, well, I guess this really has to do with the idea that now, at least in its current state, and we have to remember that Weimar Germany was exactly as crazy liberal as these supposed liberal progressives are. That there were just as many even trans people. There were people that were literally trans in Weimar Germany who were infused and enthralled by the potential of this grievance culture. Um, I mean, famously, the communists and the fascists walked hand in hand to undermine liberal values, and a liberal society and a liberal democratic edifice, because they said, we do not want to be treated as an accountable citizenry. We want to be infantilized, and we want to be delivered what we deserve. Give us what we deserve. Give us what we feel entitled to. We don't want to be responsible for, somehow we need some kind of arbitrator that will mediate between us and upon us, and surgically be able to ameliorate whatever self entitlement and lack of self empowerment, or self confidence, or self esteem, uh, uh, that we have narrated as a social injustice. And I mean, I won't put this down, because this is exactly what unified the radicals to undermine the liberal state in Weimar Germany, which was essentially the same concept, social justice. Although I would say that they did perhaps label it in a less profanely Orwellian doublespeak that we have today, but they essentially called it um, dissatisfaction. But it is the same zeitgeist as today, as the same types of personalities and natural fascists um, are feeding into creating what I can only describe as what has been empowered by these things like the holy writ of the Keegan stages, or whatever. But let me try and have another crack at disabusing people at the. So, I should probably read out what someone wrote to me, because he put it quite concisely, and then if I respond to that, it becomes actually much more concrete or clear. I'm very bad at talking about this off the cuff. It's much easier in an actual discussion. In which the contention is actually being had. So I'm having to sort of synthesize this, and sort of imagine a kind of dialogue partner, which is, it's always annoying for me, because I don't like having to sort of indulge in that kind of solipsism, just because essentially I can't find anyone to make recordings with. But and I mean, you see this in the current zeitgeist quite clearly. The current lack, they call it in my country the leadership crisis, the lack of leadership, which is that leaders will not properly control the situation, because they are culturally indentured into having to do this kind of very superficial and pretentious form of consensus building between these very vocal groups that effectively have no integrity in the claims that they make, in their subjective prattle about their aggrieved emotions, and their grievances and their narratives and their lived experiences, all of which are essentially incapable of being ameliorated or served in any meaningful sense, other than essentially proving that you care by demonstrating some zero-sum extraction, or sort of sadistic maliciousness, in the name of balancing out the karmic penalty that is implied by sort of the masochistic self-denigration of essentially identifying with a narrative. Now, obviously, narratives are certainly very real to people when there are evidence of them in present time. The problem with the concreteness of narratives is that it locks one in to facts, which then are, quite frankly and quite embarrassingly, never properly substantiated as time passes on. It is presumed that what was true in 1995 is true in 2015. Because of the concreteness of narrative. And this is the, this is why the current zeitgeist is so overtly fascistic, is because it demands that the narrative in society play a kind of hegemonic role, that individuals aren't allowed to debate, to question, to critically think independently, that some kind of lowest common denominator narrative must deliver uh, its efficacy uh, uh, and be imprinted in the mind of some decision maker or some leader or something like that. It is essentially the looming Führer principle, the decentralized Führer principle. Um, and in some sense, this is the only difference between the current zeitgeist and the advent of full-blown fascism, is that when eventually the culture is traumatized by this cultural hegemon of this proto-fascism, that it eventually just says, okay, well, maybe we'll just give it a go. Maybe we'll just let someone come along and actually be the Führer just so we can try it out. And then the problem is that, well, then you've given yourself over to an unaccountable totalitarian force that gets to effectively um, control the media, control the messages, control. Uh, uh, I mean, in some sense, it is. I mean, I could make. I could make examples of how this is essentially putting a society into the model of a particular personality schema. I mean, I do think all political, but I mean, essentially, I could at least put it broadly that it's borderline personality disorder. Fascism is frankly borderline personality disorder, writ large, on a kind of cultural, political ideology in which culture becomes a province within the political state, that culture becomes a political adjunct. Uh, uh, it's part of the political. Uh, I'm defining fascism essentially as that culture it becomes a function of of a sort of the state organ. You know, in some sense, Roman law never had to bother with uh, Roman law never had to bother dealing with these issues because essentially there was no right of assembly um, in the Roman Empire. So essentially, they quashed liberalism uh, before it had any avenue of development, or they just obviated it prescriptively. Uh, so they didn't have to get into those delicate matters um, and refine and such. Although I do think that in the principles of the law, uh, that to some degree is a useful way in navigating uh, the quite delicate problems in the human condition in the collective sense of having a functioning society. Uh, and then, the real question is, what do you maximize for? Because if you maximize for trust at the cost of integrity, or at the cost of putting a ceiling or a limitation on integrity, then you end up with a kind of a half. I can't think of the phrase that I want to use, but essentially, it's a kind of stasis. It's a kind of stalemate. It's a kind of fudged delinquency that doesn't ever have the capability of overcoming its own sort of self-imposed retardation. Um, and I do think, in some sense, Keegan merely being a psychologist, and I guess I don't know enough about his work to say this that confidently, but I mean, I'll just say in general that, look, I mean, usually the people who do great things in psychology are geniuses, but generally, the real geniuses, if I could, that there are categories of genius within genius, that these are maybe third order geniuses, or second rate geniuses, um, that stand above other people in a field that is itself fundamentally intellectually impoverished. I mean, psychology is really, in general, the dregs of intellectualism. I mean, these are people who historically failed to get into medicine, and so they became psychologists. That is the kind of the general gist of the field itself. Usually, people from high status backgrounds failed to get into medicine, became psychologists, because then you could have a doctor in your name. That is the state of the field. And quite frankly, it is a field that needs very special care, because in some sense, to be an effective uh, harbinger of some real progress within the field, uh, you really have to be at the top of the pile. You really have to uh, be pretty astute in terms of philosophy, and you have to be pretty astute, I would say, specifically moral philosophy, to some degree, but also, well, I mean, intellectualism is a huge field. I mean, I mean, well, I'll say what I did. I mean, you have to, gain an appreciation for probably religious studies to some degree, and but a critical. I mean, not a broad interest, a critical interest, a very very, in view of building some kind of cohesive, coherent model of something, because you have to basically build your own Taoism. Um, anyway, I'm talking so broadly, it's vague and embarrassing, but you need like a Newtonian kind of intellect, but focused on psychology, uh, and in some sense, that kind of thinking is, frankly, probably not even broad enough. Um, uh, this is somewhat tricky, because I'm basically uh, saying that I profess myself to be more intelligent than Newton. Um, I mean, Newton was I mean, people forget, or people perhaps don't know how broad Newton was in his intellectualism. I mean, he was an American judge, as well as a esotericist, or whatever, an occultist. I mean, he was an alchemist as well, I believe, but they all were in those days. And that really allowed people, I think, a much richer and deeper spiritual window into, because already there was a deep synthesis on the table, or of conceptual animation of concepts and topics that uh, so I don't want to say too nice things, because I think someone who considers themselves a deist um, is psychologically impoverished. But that's quite a stark claim to make, and I don't know if I want to defend uh, that claim in this recording. But I do perhaps want to talk badly about perennialism and solipsism, uh, of which deism, I think, is probably some kind of compromised tug of war between some commixture or some elements of both perennialism and solipsism. But I realize that that's not a sufficient argument to make. But let me focus on solipsism and perennialism. Um, Both, I think, are intrinsic components to what I have already denoted as sort of the fascistic envelope of culture, um, and the atomism and the autism within the void of a nihilistic culture. Uh, and in its nihilism, it gives room for this epistemic pluralism. Now, epistemic pluralism is the concept that I would link to perennialism. The idea is essentially that the zeitgeist is something like the Holy Ghost, to use my Christian language, or just to say that essentially the collective narrative is the operative spirit of the world. I mean, that's what zeitgeist means. It's what I believe it translates to: world spirit, essentially, or the spirit of the times, perhaps. And in some sense, that's what I think perennialism is essentially the confusion or the conflation of the authority of a god, or the god. I mean, I do think God and the authority are almost equivalent um, concepts. Uh, the God of the world is the authority of the world. The God of the spirit is the authority of the spirit. Um, but already then you can see that I've contracted it into at least a monotheistic sort of conception of God, um, using the God. But yeah, I mean, anyway, perhaps I'll talk about pantheism afterwards. But essentially, what I see perennialists doing is that for them, the live karmic conduit of the unconscious container, as it were, is itself uh, the participatory role that it shoehorns the individual in the midst thereof, um, is the calling towards worshipping at the feet of the perennial uh, winds, principalities of the air, as might be doctrinally described. Now the solipsistic element to this is that, or autistic is perhaps a better sort of word, because it's not strictly solipsistic, but I would say de facto it is a kind of solipsism. But I think it's definitely accurate to call them autistic. uh, which is to mean that they are concerned with the self, because in such a wise, everyone else is reduced into a kind of participatory, codependent reflection of the authority to yourself. So it's like I'm the percipient, and everyone else collectively is God. And if I'm coming up against the wrong person, it's because you're a demonic force, and I need to steer myself towards the angelic forces. Now, there is some truth to bootstrapping responsibility, I think. So there is a kind of truth in personal navigation there, but it's not cannot be confused as a kind of absolute truth. Um, so I mean, I do think that to a large extent we can navigate um, but there are some anyways, I don't want to get into all these sort of tricky sort of sub tangents, but and lose my general thread. You see, that's what I'm trying to avoid. It's getting bogged down in weeds, and then finding more weeds within the weeds, and then completely losing the general thrust. So I'll just put an asterisk there, and perhaps, yeah, because I really could get into that, but I don't want to derail. So what was I saying? That the autism is concerned with itself. Because in some sense, the self is reflected in the perennialism, and therefore there is a kind of indirect identification with oneself as God. Now, let me just distinctly or uh, contrast this with my own view of which is that I claim to understand godliness. That is my link to the divine, is my understanding of it. So my mind, which is not my brain, my mind is in functional terms, I'll even describe it as the only begotten Son. And that means in functional terms that I take 100% responsibility for apportioning blame from within my mind. And out of this blame, I construct a reality. A reality which I contend has the possibility of being shared. Although it's hard to make any further thing than that. Uh, in some sense, that's potentially an unproven claim. In some sense, I don't know the answer to that question, so I should perhaps be more humble about making such a statement. Um, I hope that it's capable of being shared. Okay, so and I think that blame, the consensus on that blame, has to be an interpersonal consensus. It can't be a collective, third party ideology. It has to be duplicated from individual to individual. When it's based on a hypothetical generalization, either one of those things, I think, mean the other thing in this context. It's essentially only requiring that it hedges itself, or that it hangs itself on the predicate that the alternative is a skeptical doubt. So essentially, all you have to do is sort of be. So that's a very complicated way of saying. Um, that if you can conjecture a specious dilemma or doubt or quandary, then you would have the right, uh, according to a self-consistent schema, that your generalization or hypothetical is good enough to service as a kind of mob rule, self-organizing collective intelligence. And that is what we are witnessing and seeing in this disgusting low bar in culture, where blatant propaganda in so-called journalism. And where is the subjective, enlightened, interpersonal truth-telling? It exists on Fox News. Fox News is the fairest and the most honest form of analysis, at least in terms of its architecture, in terms of its format. Obviously, individual anchors could be particularly critiqued and criticized, and in some sense that is the nature of their particular work, is to roll with the punches and to evolve and develop or substantiate and defend. Rather than the profane lie that CNN tells about its objective journalism and its professionalism. It might as well be, its editors might as well be of the same quality as those people who filled the halls of the propaganda studios in any authoritarian, tyrannical, cultish observances of some dogmatic orthodox stricture. At least the integrity of the news in Fox News is borne by the anchors themselves. Or at least their art can be criticized if they are in as much as people have created valences and characters. Famously, I'm thinking of, oh my word, this is so embarrassing, I've forgotten his name. Oh my word. Glenn Beck. And I think that Glenn Beck's journey is a testament to the fairness that Fox inculcates in its participants in terms of its content purveyors, or content purveyorship. Content creators. Anyway, I'm specifically referring to Glenn Beck's evolution and review of his own personal development. Anyway, what shall I move on to? I said I might talk about Pananthism, which maybe also might be a kind of weird middling concoction of bit of column A, bit of column B, in the same way that deism is probably a sort of, well, I think deism and panentheism could often be. I mean, in some sense, deism is usually the the word used by some kind of very rational type of person who wants to contain the mystery of coherence and reason and set it to one side and veil the face of God from themselves, but not be a complete sort of pedant and idiot, and therefore will admit the prevalence of some deep concordance to some ephemeral coherence that seems manifest and mirrored in myriad facets and layers of at least perhaps the internal and the external the ebbs and flows of life, or something like that, that beckon to some metaphysical, richer, deeper reasoning which cannot be deductively extracted according to their deistic inclination, which is to say that their inclination is to reach for a heuristic and a label for a kind of spiritual identity, perhaps, or narrative, which leads them away from needing to indulge in an inductive inquiry and searching. So they have untethered their spiritual metaphysic from their personal awareness of, or at least when I say personal awareness, I mean their incarnated experience can be unbridled, um, or unplugged from a grand mystery, so that it can perform rational dalliances, um, and perhaps other kinds of diversionary, um, interest seeking, in the hopes of finding further deductive implementations, perhaps. And privately, even in their ascription to their own deism, uh, they might yet further be believers in what manifested spiritual uh, motivation courses through them that they leave unnamed, um, and unexamined, but that is understood uh, below the level of language, at which case, they have potentially a deistic, self-identified believer, in inverted commas, uh, might have simply sequestered, let's say, uh, their basic essence uh, from their languaged, um, sphere of rational operation. And in some sense, I do think that they, in their languaged way of being, they have made a simple philosophical confusion, which is the idea that rationality um, has anything to do with being correct or true, when rationality is merely uh, a property of self-consistency. And when I say self-consistency, um, that is itself contextually bound into a kind of temporal framing. Uh, and I consider all these things to be subject to intellectual reframing. Uh, and so, what is self consistent on one day might be self inconsistent after just adding one more datum, one more factoid, one more plotted point on the graph, or revising a pre-existing point on the graph, or reevaluating any individual existing point on the graph. Uh, so self-consistency is always a frozen snapshot, whereas the percipient, the subjective experiencer of consciousness, uh, is either a static intellect or a static spiritual address or identity. Um, so I probably slightly just misspoke, because this also can be said in relation to the soul instead of the spirit. But then but in some sense, but I guess, yeah. So I mean, you can describe the same thing in terms of the spirit, in terms of the soul, and then you could also describe it in terms of a deism in the role of supplementing for an active role of the spirit, or supplementing for an active role of the soul. Although I would say if it's supplementing for the active role of the soul, then it would be sort of perennialism. Probably more so. I do think deism has to do with this weird kind of compartmentalization of the spirit itself. Um, or the inability for the spirit to colonize language. Um, I do think I have worked out generally the ingredients of a model that covers psychologically or philosophically all of these labels, because then I think that in some sense panentheism is when you identify yourself as being the soul and you sort of conflate any causative, because in some sense the spirit itself could be amalgamated into the creative force or the generative force of a creator. Um, and so the panentheism is the idea that all spirit is this kind of intricate amalgamation of multiple contending and collaborative and interfering sort of spiritual uh, distinctiveness, but sort of collective togetherness or something like that. So it's almost like a kind of perennialism, but within the smaller container. Or it's very much like perennialism, but perennialism has to do with the understanding the distinct nature of the soul, or soul containers, whereas panentheism is understanding a kind of, or pretentiously modeling a kind of ultimate synthesis of uh, collective spiritual forces into an amalgamate that is like God, in a collective sense, and also in a subcomponential sense then as well. But in some sense, it's a fudged sort of story. It's a fudged story about spirit. So it's a weird kind of lots of things happening at once. But sorry, this also led me to wanting to make another comment that I've just forgotten now, which is that I'll just say that a lot of these problems are very elegantly uh, resolved and reconciled, I would say fundamentally perfectly, by the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. Um, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. which I would just weave into what I was saying about the necessary colonization of language for the Spirit to be properly integrated. The only begotten Son, the Son, the Word, as is mentioned in the Trinitarian exposition. In 1 John chapter 5. What's my point? Why did that come up for me? That came up for me because when I was thinking about the Pananthism and the weird kind of fudged spiritual soup and amalgamation, and collectively and individually, again, there's something to that, but it's very noxiously intoxicating. I mean, in some sense, I would say that in the same way that I would call myself a completed Nietzschean nihilist, in that sort of having gone through the slings and arrows of living with Nietzschean nihilism, and fully digesting it and synthesizing it into a transcendental I'm specifically talking about the paper or the chapter in the book. I believe the book is called Living with Nihilism, but the chapter is written by Vasti Root. Very excellent paper, which I would also read in concordance with Epistemic Agency by Catherine Elgin. Anyway, what I'd just say about Nietzschean nihilism is that I think in some sense the autism or solipsism and the perennialism and what I've described as panentheism or deism, which are in some sense, I think that these have deep resemblances to the developmental forms of toxicity or arrested development, which are represented in the Keegan stages of development to some degree. Then I do think that they do require kind of phenomenological self-inquiry that does become a perpetual pursuit of seeking the kingdom, I would say, which is a pursuit which never dies. You are in the pursuit of it. and you're growing and edified by the pursuit. It is somewhat the food, but this, I mean, I don't want to proselytize this too abstractly and hollowly, because I think that it has to be embodied, and in some sense is not going to be embodied unless you're growing in your ability to take responsibility. Hmm. And that has to sort of include the ability to bootstrap responsibility, but also the awareness of when your bootstrapping is not sticking, and then the humility to troubleshoot and perhaps to seek far afield resolution. And I'm going to say a bit of nonsense, I guess, and sort of be clever enough to be lucky, and be humble enough to be uh, in awe of your cleverness, which was undeserved, and then uh, be ungrateful for the narrative which carried you thus far, and uh, stupid enough to realize how silly you were in thinking about uh, such narrative inceptions or adoptions, and realizing that you were just trading one for another, as you were seeking to find yourself ejected and free and clear of the last. And the idea that the stream itself, some connection between some first and some last, to see it in the round of some totality, but also not get lost in the monotonous, unceasing flow, perhaps. You know, you have to go through that kind of gauntlet if you're going to be able to deal with the concept of an everlasting. I just want to speak. Oh, I was just going to add more stuff, but I think that kind of finishes that off a little bit. But as a just kind of as a template mock up, sort of demonstration of a kind of flow into some of the kind of topics around transcendence, but also futility and mundanity, but I was going to talk about loneliness, but I do think generally loneliness, in some sense, is more in today's society a symptom of the lack of authenticity and integrity in the culture at large. That people forget um, the 90s, where it was okay not to be aware of the performance of your identity, and so you could just negotiate as an integral entity with boundaries that weren't penetrated by someone demanding special consideration for how you adapt your language patterns uh, to suit their self-image. Essentially because non-sexism was killed by feminists who quite frankly did exactly what they did in Weimar Germany in 1920s and create a cultural envelope in which, I mean, people forget, but it was actually the women in the Nazi movement that made it a successful cultural movement. It was, I mean, in some sense, fascism is even the brainchild, I would say, uh, not of a power crazed um, tyrant, but of an ally, of some borderline caretaker. I mean, I'm sorry to lay this on here, but you know, as is actually in most of the case of male monsters, men who are monsters are the creation of women who were, quite frankly, unwell. And it is very clear that uh, the development of Hitler's ideology was a direct reflection of Hitler modeling. Uh, I don't know if it was Hitler's mother or his primary caretaker, which I believe was his aunt, but certainly some combination of female caretaker in Hitler's life. Uh, I mean, I would. I won't say MBTI type as a description, but Hitler quite clearly understood at a very deep psychological level the type of pathology which he normalized, and he turned it into a political edifice. He turned it into a model for politics. And quite weirdly, anyway, it's an interesting metaphor to explore, but essentially the sort of the feminine grace which is inculcated into it's almost a sort of the juxtaposition, because there's almost a kind of there's an irony to the steel iconography, the steely iconography in fascism. There's a slight irony that somehow your race and your culture, your soil and your blood, has a kind of feminine uh, narrative resonance. Uh, and in some sense, I think that was the repackaged uh, psychological technology, which, to be quite honest, I think was inculcated into the root of psychology, um, which has had a deep corruption in culture, from the Austrian root. But anyway, I'm talking about Pavlov and such, and behaviorism, and which at least was, for a time, it was delayed by Chomsky, in fact, which is why it's so deplorable, and also, I would say, ironic that anyway, I'm not going to go deeper into ideology. I don't want to switch around the subject matter too much, but I think I've just run out of subject matter. After introducing that very strange tangent at the end there, I don't want to speak ill of Noam Chomsky quite much further. I have railed against him, but I think at some point it I mean, when he has given the so-called left messages, I think they have generally been at least peppered with enough cause for this proto-fascist mob uh, to, if they were to take what Noam Chomsky said to heart, uh, to see some fundamental problem in their blind observance to radical fervor. Which, quite frankly, I would say is premised in not willing the means to the ends, but in some sense blindly following some means that has some crazy It's very interesting what happened to Alex Jones. Deplatformed because he made some rich people and powerful people nervous. And culturally, they got away with silencing him. It's disgusting. That's the kind of hypocrisy we have to look forward to. With these kinds of revolutionaries, you don't even need oppressors. We'll never need oppressors ever again because we're going to be headed for the junk pile. And maybe there'll be warlords, I guess, which is in some sense hard to define as an oppressor because in some sense they'll be necessities of life probably. Because we'll be going back to the might makes right. Because that's what you get with your good intentions and your self-organizing collective intelligence. Or should I rather say that is all you fucking deserve to grow up. Sadly, that's the problem with proto-fascists, is the only way to actually prove them wrong is to give them what they want and destroy everyone in the process. And so we just have to put up with their psychological parasitism and their and their psychic vampirism. And that's the perniciousness of the borderline tendency. I didn't, I guess, prove a lot of the things that I said. I just described them, but I didn't substantiate them fully. But and I will say, I think that natural borderlines, and there's a whole different species and gambit of natural borderlines. Many of them, I think, are not necessarily that toxic. In fact, they are actually can be quite fine people. They just need very stable cultural edifices. They need very stable environmental rules and structures. And when you start making, let's say, society safe for these people to have an equal share of power and to be an equal participant, well, then you have a crisis in leadership, and you have a crisis in what is effectively becomes the new normal of demagoguery and lowest common denominator sympathy extraction, and sympathy mongering and sanctimonious field marshalling and other forms of suboptimal profane mob rule. Sort of emotional vomiting. It's very. I wonder. I wonder how to describe it. From my perspective, at least. I can talk about its effects in the world, I guess, but I mean, I have described it as essentially Keegan stage 3 puppeting Keegan stage 2 and Keegan stage 4, like two chips on its shoulder, and each of those chip shoulders squarely balance each other out in some sense, because one is the reflection of the other. It considers itself an equilibrium, and then therefore it considers itself a kind of meta fluidity, because it can use its ego to compensate for narcissistic indulgence and dalliance and temporaneous profundity. And in some sense, the residue in the Keegan stage 3, the unconsciousness, just becomes a kind of sandpit and playground where things are there to be devalued at a whimsy or at uh, some conduit sort of bypass on the way to performing this internal equilibrium. Where there's sort of no coherent answer to the question, who are other people? Or at least no coherent ethic about how that question is contended. Or at least that question is not asked with any stable kind of conviction. In some sense, there's no stable self, there's just a kind of equilibriumed self. And so there's just a kind of external conditioning and an internal conditioning, and they're sort of set one against the other, sort of like two books leaning against each other, acting as their own bookends. But there's no clear demarcation between the stages. They just kind of become a fluid amalgamation, and then it just sort of takes on the status of the highest one, while it enjoys the mischievousness that it can have with any of its lower facilities. As a kind of compartmentalized ethical obtuseness. I guess that's what I find most disingenuous or inauthentic about these sorts of people is the strange kind of unilateral hypocrisy. That their practices must be honored. And their practices have a kind of ethical denotation. But then in another breath, ethical denotations are compartmentally decontextualized as unimportant. So you get this kind of cloak and dagger, hit and run, sort of projection, labeling, sort of whack-a-mole, disengaged, judgmentalness, which is overtly capricious, and then in some sense its capriciousness is just relabeled as metafluid. But I mean, this is what you expect from epistemological pluralists. It's just, I must say, the hypocrisy I do find taxing. I mean, this is the stage of development that you should have exhausted with your peers when you were 11 years old, getting into arguments with people. That had this kind of profuse, conceited, impudent obtuseness. I mean, I was definitely this obtuse when I was 11 years old, because you have to go through this. You have to know how to develop a polemic before you can recognize that you've constructed a Tower of Babel. You have to know that you're capable of constructing a Tower of Babel. and you're capable of enslaving yourself to believing in it, so that you can live in its shadow as a humble person. And then when someone comes up to you to try to sell you some new fad or fashion, you can say, no, I'm still living in the shadow of something that I helped construct, and it doesn't make it. You see, it's a waste of time. So no, I'm not going to buy into the new fad. Thank you very much. Like I've already done my time, and I'm not going to be following that, or something like that. But I mean, obviously, you should be nice to salesmen. You shouldn't just send them off, perhaps, without an honest word, perhaps, if they seem honest enough in their pitch. I mean, I do think that that's almost more important, is the in some sense, that's the only way you get the clarity and the simplicity in your unconsciousness, in order to start to really stress test and refine what I would call is the transpersonal bridge from Keegan stage 3 to Keegan stage 4, which has to do with all that subjective enlightenment stuff I was talking about. Anyway, this is getting probably much too much like pontification, but yeah, let me stop this embarrassing recording. I've gone over this stuff in much more detail in I've probably got a recording somewhere that specifically addresses my model of self-actualization, which talks about these sort of stages of development.